Welcome to the programme. It's the worst outbreak of violence since anti-government protesters stormed Thailand's government complex a week ago. On Tuesday, clashes between supporters and opponents of Prime Minister Samak Suntaraway left one person dead and 44 people injured. Samak has now declared a state of emergency, turning over police powers to the army. But this time, it seems they've been reluctant to get involved. From Bangkok, here's Selina Downs.
Fighting for his survival. Prime Minister Samak Suntaraway declared a state of emergency Tuesday in a bid to rein in protests which have paralysed his power.
This situation gives me no alternative solutions. I choose the softest solution within the limited choices, to declare a state of emergency only in Bangkok, in order to solve and finish this problem, according to the law.
A deadly clash between pro- and anti-government activists, the worst violence since the protests began 3 months ago. The Prime Minister claiming they're now a threat to the nation's security. But just a few kilometres away, the People's Alliance for Democracy were dug in, unfazed by the emergency order. They say they won't budge until the government of Samak resign.
You better hear us now, because this is what we think we need you to do. And if you don't do it, we're going to do a non-violent civil disobedience.
You need him to resign?
I need him to resign. It's beyond repair.
The PAD may get its wish as more pressure is piled on the government. Thailand's Electoral Commission recommending the courts move to dissolve the ruling People Power Party over allegations of vote buying in the December election. The party could be dissolved like its predecessor Thairak Thai, the ruling party of the former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who was ousted in a military coup in 2006. Protesters claim the current government of Samak is a puppet of Thaksin's and want them out as well. But as the Prime Minister was declaring a state of emergency, the army said it wouldn't use force to break up the demonstrations. It says it's up to the government to find a solution to the crisis.
Soldiers and police will be in the middle to halt any violence. I want them to use the intelligence and the legal system to stop any confrontations. Using firearms will only create more problems and it will affect the country.
The ball now firmly back in the Prime Minister's court. Many believe he has few options but to resign. As labour unions vow to strike Wednesday, the capital is bracing for electricity and water shortages to add to the transport chaos in recent days. Selina Downs, Al-Jazeera, Bangkok.
Now, millions on the move, dozens dead, and that toll is expected to rise. Almost 2 weeks after the Kosi River burst its banks in northern India, many villages are still waiting for help. The government's mounted one of its biggest ever relief efforts, but is still facing criticism over its response. Imran Khan has the latest.
As the aid comes crashing down, the Indian Army and Navy try desperately to reach all those affected by the floods that have coated land across Bihar. The floods came rapidly and without warning when the river Kosi burst a dam in neighbouring Nepal. Devastation ensued. And now, in desperation, some have begun looting aid. Police are left with little choice and try and protect the aid, pitching flood victim against those there to help.
People are hungry and they are running from pillar to post to get food. Instead of food, we got battened charged by police. We want food.
The death toll, according to the government, is 90 dead. But activists and local media say the figure could be many times higher. Some are even saying it could run into the thousands. Adding to the misery, wells that provide drinking water have been flooded with sewage, refuse and dead bodies. One man was blunt about the situation they now face.
We are languishing here under an open sky facing the rains and water. There is no provision of any bedding or any other facility to protect us from the water.
The people in camps like his, however, are the lucky ones. They have some clean water, basic sanitation and healthcare. But that provision needs to be rapidly expanded if more lives are to be saved. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining me on the line from Bihar is Bjorn Nissen from the aid group Médecins Sans Frontières. Bjorn Nissen, what's your assessment of the situation on the ground, and is it likely to perhaps get worse?
Yes, I think we will see a deterioration of the situation when more people are coming into the camps, because we are still having big numbers out in the flooded areas, and what we have seen so far doing our assessment is that there is a basic response from the authorities in the camps. There are distribution of shelter, there are latrines, there are medical relief camps to some extent, but we will see if they can cope with the big numbers when they are coming in.
The Indian government has been heavily criticised about its response to the floods. I mean, have the authorities just been overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster?
I think it's important to remember here that you're not talking about a small number of people. We're talking about millions of people affected here. And Bihar is a state with 85 million people. So I'm sure it's going to be discussions in the future about the emergency preparedness plan for Bihar on this kind of disaster. But I have to say that from my side here on the eastern side of the flood, that we as a medical NGO, okay, we are seeing that there is already a minimal medical setup in the camps, and there are some response from the government. So I don't want to criticize because they're heavily focused on search and rescue activities still.
Just briefly, let's just talk about your organisation, Médecins Sans Frontières. What are you doing on the ground to help these people?
Now we are doing mobile clinics, and we are trying to assess the more vulnerable, the displaced people who are not still yet in the camps, or maybe new spontaneous camps who are popping up and don't still have the assistance from the government. And I hope that in the next 10 days we will also provide a bit of surveillance and monitoring by being mobile, and we can also function as an early warning system in case there should be any epidemics.
OK, Bjorn Nissen there in Bihar, thank you very much indeed. Now, Russia is claiming a diplomatic victory at the EU's decision not to impose sanctions over the Georgia crisis, calling the decision responsible. Well, let's cross to Barbara Serra in our London News Centre has got more details. Barbara, over to you.
Darren, thank you. Well, Moscow simply called the EU criticism of its actions in Georgia a difference of opinion and was happy that most EU countries had shown they wanted to continue to deal with Russia. Well, the country had repeatedly warned against sanctions, and newspaper headlines across the country echoed that sentiment. Well, in a moment, we'll be live to Moscow to hear from our correspondent there. But first, let's go to Georgia and get the views of the people in the capital, Tbilisi.
I'm not satisfied at all. I was expecting that something would have been decided, but I didn't hear anything serious. At the very least, I was expecting that they would demand that Russia withdraw their troops to the pre-conflict line.
The EU statement was some kind of compromise, of course, but on the other hand, there is a danger that if you push such a rude and unruly force into a corner, there could be more dangerous consequences. That's the way Europe thinks, and from a humanitarian and logical point of view, it's completely understandable.
I'm not completely satisfied, of course. I expected sanctions to be implemented.
The views there of some of the people in Tbilisi. Unsurprisingly, they're disappointed. Meanwhile, Russia has praised that decision by the EU. The country's Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, called it common sense. Well, let's cross to Moscow now and speak to our correspondent, Niamh Barker. So, Niamh, no talk of sanctions yet, but just how relieved are Russia? I mean, ultimately, how damaging would EU sanctions have been?
Well, Russia took a gamble, and it seems to have paid off. A palpable sense of relief from both Prime Minister and President. Both of them have said that reason has prevailed. This as Russia now announces that it has no intention of reducing energy supplies to Europe. After all, Russia provides up to a third of the continent with its oil and gas. So sanctions would have undoubtedly not only hit Moscow, but would have also hit Europe as well, something which the European bloc has definitely taken into consideration when deciding whether or not to impose these sanctions on Moscow.
So, Niamh, for now, an escalation of tensions has been averted, but of course that could possibly not last very long because Russia does plan to go ahead with a plan to set up bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This may well throw another spanner in the works for Russia-EU relations. Both South Ossetia and Abkhazia have asked the Russians to send peacekeeping forces to both regions